She kept 3 children secret from their billionaire father for 19 years, not out of cruelty, out of mercy. But now she's dying, and the mercy has become a lie. 6 months left to live. 6 months to introduce a man who built empires to the 3 teenagers who've learned to survive without him. 6 months to answer the question that will haunt all of them. Did she protect her children, or did she rob them of a father they deserved? The fluorescent lights in Dr. Patel's office hummed the way they always did, steady, indifferent, completely unaware that the woman sitting across from him had just stopped breathing. Not literally. Linda Davison's chest still rose and fell. Her heart still beat, though it felt slower now, heavier, like it knew what was coming before her mind could catch up. 6 months, Dr. Patel said again, softer this time, as if lowering his voice would somehow soften the blow. Linda blinked once, twice. She didn't cry. She didn't gasp or grip the armrests, or ask him to repeat himself, even though everything in her wanted to pretend she'd misheard. Instead, she sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap the way she'd taught Kelly, Harris, and Sandy to sit during parent-teacher conferences. Composed, controlled, present. Now pay close attention to what she does next. 6 months, she repeated, testing the words in her mouth like they were in a language she didn't quite speak yet. Maybe more, maybe less. Dr. Patel nodded, his expression practiced in the specific kind of gentleness reserved for delivering death sentences to people still breathing. He'd done this before, probably hundreds of times. He knew how to sit, how to pause, how to let silence do the heavy lifting. But Linda didn't need silence. She needed a plan. What do I need to do? She asked, voice steady, businesslike, the same tone she used when negotiating extra shifts at the diner or arguing down late fees at the electric company. Dr. Patel hesitated, clearly thrown. Most patients asked why, or how, or simply broke down. Linda Davison wasn't most patients, and what she was about to do would change 4 lives forever. We'll start palliative care, he began carefully. Focus on quality of life, pain management. There are support groups, counseling services. I don't need a support group, Linda interrupted, not unkindly. I need to know how long I can work. How long before I can't hide it from my kids? How long before I lose the ability to take care of things myself? The doctor's pen stilled over his notepad. Mrs. Davison. Miss, she corrected automatically. 19 years of filling out forms as a single mother had trained that reflex into muscle memory. Miss Davison, he amended gently, I understand you want to stay strong for your children, but this is also about you, your health, your needs. Linda almost smiled at that. Her needs. She'd stopped cataloging those around the time Harris learned to walk and immediately started climbing everything in sight, while Kelly tried to parent him, and Sandy watched it all with those unsettlingly observant eyes. I appreciate that, Dr. Patel, she said, standing before he could say anything else that might crack the careful composure she was holding together with sheer will. I'll call to schedule the follow-up. She shook his hand, firm, brief, final, and walked out of his office with her purse clutched against her ribs and her spine straight. She made it all the way to the parking lot, all the way to her 15-year-old Honda with the dent in the passenger door from when she'd clipped a shopping cart during a snowstorm because she'd been working a double and hadn't slept in 30 hours. She unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, closed the door, and then only then did Linda Davison let herself shatter. Her hands shook so violently she couldn't grip the steering wheel. Her breath came in ragged, uneven gasps that didn't feel like enough air, would never be enough air, because how was she supposed to breathe knowing she only had 6 months left? 6 months to prepare Kelly for college applications she'd never see submitted. 6 months to make sure Harris stopped hiding his poetry notebooks like they were contraband. 6 months to teach Sandy that being quiet didn't mean being invisible. 6 months to finish 18 years of motherhood. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The sob that tore out of her chest sounded like something breaking. And maybe it was. Maybe this was the sound of a woman who'd held everything together, finally understanding that no amount of strength could hold back what was coming. She cried until her throat burned, until her eyes swelled, until the tears stopped coming, not because the grief had passed, but because her body simply had nothing left to give. And then because Linda Davison had learned a long time ago that falling apart was a luxury she couldn't afford for long, she pulled herself back together. Here's what you need to understand about Linda. She wasn't just a single mother. She was a woman who'd made an impossible choice 19 years ago. A choice that was about to catch up with her. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her jacket, found a crumpled napkin in the glove compartment, and cleaned the mascara streaks from under her eyes, checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, and practiced the smile she'd need when she walked through the front door in 40 minutes. Tired, but not devastated. Worn, but not broken. Just another long day at the end of a long string of long days. Because that's what mothers did. They carried the weight no one else could see and made it look easy. As Linda started the engine, her phone buzzed in the cup holder. A text from Kelly. "Mom, where are you? Sandy won't stop bugging me about dinner, and Harris ate the last of the bread, again." Linda's chest tightened, but this time, it wasn't grief. It was love, fierce and aching and impossibly complicated. She typed back, "On my way. Tell Harris if he ate the evidence, he's making the grocery run." 3 dots appeared. Then, "He says he has homework. Tell him I said nice try." A laughing emoji popped up, followed by, "He's grabbing his shoes." Linda set the phone down, pulled out of the parking space, and drove toward home. But her mind wasn't on the road. It was on the mental inventory she'd started the moment Dr. Patel had said 6 months. The ruthless, methodical cataloging of everything she needed to finish before time ran out. The college fund she'd been contributing to for 18 years. It was enough for Kelly, barely enough for one of the boys, but not all 3. She'd need to talk to the financial aid office, research scholarships, make sure they understood how to navigate the system without her. The life insurance policy through the diner. Small, but it would cover funeral costs and maybe a few months of rent if they were careful. She'd need to make sure the beneficiary information was updated, make sure someone explained to the kids how to access it. The photo albums she'd been meaning to organize since the triplets were born. Boxes of pictures still unsorted, memories unlabeled, stories untold. If she didn't do it now, who would know which beach trip was which? Which birthday party had the cake disaster? Which Christmas Harris had cried because he thought Santa forgot him? And then, buried beneath all the practical preparations, beneath the lists and logistics and carefully controlled panic, was the question she'd been avoiding for 18 years. The question that had just become unavoidable. Mark. Remember this name. Because what happens when he finds out will change everything. Linda's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Mark Jenkins. The name felt foreign in her mind now, like something from a past life. Which, in a way, it was. 19 years ago, Mark had been a different man. Ambitious, yes. Driven, absolutely. But also, warm. Funny in a self-deprecating way that made you want to root for him. He'd had dreams the size of skyscrapers and a bank account that could barely cover rent. She'd loved him for the dreams. Left him because of them. Or if she was being honest, which seemed important now that she was dying, she'd left because she was terrified he'd resent her. Resent them. The 3 tiny lives growing inside her that she hadn't planned for and he definitely wasn't ready for. He'd panicked when she told him she was pregnant. Transferred money she hadn't asked for. Asked for time he didn't have. And Linda, 25 years old, scared and convinced she knew how the story would end, had disappeared. She never told him it was triplets. Never gave him the chance to choose them. Never let him prove whether he would have stayed or run. But here's the thing nobody talks about sometimes. The choices we make to protect the people we love end up being the ones that hurt them most. For 18 years, she told herself it was the right choice. That she'd protected her children from disappointment. From a father who might have loved his empire more than he loved them. But now she had 6 months. And her children, brilliant, complicated, wholly themselves, deserved to know where half of their DNA came from. They deserved to know their father. Even if he'd become someone she didn't recognize anymore. Linda had seen the articles, the Forbes covers, the interviews, where Mark Jenkins, Billionaire CEO, talked about disrupting industries and scaling companies and building legacies. He'd built everything he dreamed of. Everything except a family. Because he didn't know he had one. If you've ever kept a secret that felt like protection but might have been fear, if you've ever wondered whether honesty comes too late or right on time, you're going to want to stay for this. Because what Linda is about to do, takes more courage than 19 years of raising children alone. Hit that subscribe button, because this story is just beginning. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when a billionaire discovers he's been a father all along. The guilt of that hit Linda in waves, sharp and relentless. She'd made a choice for all of them, for Mark, for Kelly, for Harris, for Sandy, and now she had to unmake it. She had to tell him. But not yet. Not tonight. Tonight, she needed to be mom. Just mom. The woman who remembered to pick up bread, who refereed sibling arguments, who pretended everything was fine, because fine was the only option. Tomorrow, or the day after, or maybe the day after that, when she'd figured out how to say the unsayable, she'd deal with Mark Jenkins. But tonight belonged to her children. The ones who didn't know their time with her had just been measured in months. The ones who still believed their mother was invincible. Linda pulled into the driveway of their small rental house, the same one they'd lived in since the triplets were 2. The porch light was on. Through the window, she could see movement, Kelly gesturing emphatically about something, Harris probably arguing back, Sandy observing it all with that quiet intensity that missed nothing. Her whole world contained in one small house. 6 months to protect it. 6 months to prepare them. 6 months to make sure that when she was gone, they wouldn't just survive. They'd thrive. Linda turned off the engine, grabbed her purse, and walked toward the front door. She didn't know it yet, but tomorrow morning, a news alert would flash across a tablet 200 miles away. A billionaire CEO would see a photo he wasn't supposed to see, and the life Linda Davison had so carefully built in secret would begin to unravel. But tonight, just for tonight, her children were still hers alone, and that would have to be enough. Mark Jenkins didn't believe in distractions. Distractions cost money, cost focus, cost the razor-thin edge that separated companies that dominated from companies that disappeared. So when his tablet lit up during the keynote third buzz, in as many minutes, he ignored it. 2,000 people filled the conference hall. Investors, competitors, journalists with recorders aimed at the stage like weapons. They'd paid between $500 and $5,000 per seat to hear him speak about market disruption, about the future of logistics technology, about how his company had turned a dying industry into a $15 billion empire in under a decade. Mark didn't waste their time, or his own. The mistake most CEOs make, he said, voice cutting through the silence with the kind of authority that came from being right more often than not, is treating innovation like a luxury, something you invest in when you have extra capital, when the board's happy, when the stock price is up. He paused, letting the words settle. Innovation isn't a luxury, it's oxygen, and if you're not breathing it every single day, you're already dying. You just don't know it yet. Appreciative murmurs rippled through the audience. A few people nodded. Someone in the third row was typing furiously, probably live tweeting the whole thing. Mark felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not pride, not the thrill he used to feel in the early days, when every speech was a gamble, and every investor meeting could make or break him. Now it was just execution. Expectation met. Box checked. The tablet buzzed again. But what Mark was about to see would prove his own words right in a way he never expected. Sometimes you're dying, and you just don't know it yet. Mark's jaw tightened, irritation flickering beneath his carefully controlled expression. James knew better than to interrupt during a keynote, unless it was catastrophic. Server breach. Hostile takeover attempt. Something that required immediate. The screen lit up one more time. And this time, Mark's eyes caught the preview notification before he could stop himself. Local woman with terminal illness, lauded for raising triplets alone. His hand froze mid-gesture. The audience was still watching, waiting for him to continue, but Mark's brain had stopped processing the room, stopped processing anything except the 3 words that didn't make sense together. Terminal illness, triplets, alone. He tapped the screen. The article loaded, and the ground opened beneath him. The photo was small, embedded halfway down the page, but Mark would have recognized her in a crowd of 10,000 people. Linda. Older, yes. Thinner. Hair shorter than he remembered, streaks of gray at the temples she hadn't tried to hide. But her eyes, those same steady, impossible-to-read eyes that used to watch him sketch out business plans at 3 in the morning on napkins, were unmistakable. She was smiling in the photo, not a big smile. Just the slight curve of lips that said she was tolerating the camera, doing it for someone else's benefit. And standing beside her, Arranged like mirror images were 3 teenagers. 2 boys, 1 girl, 18, maybe, could have been 19. Dark hair, strong jawlines. The boy on the left had his hands shoved in his pockets the exact same way Mark always stood when he was uncomfortable. The girl had her chin tilted at that specific angle, defiant, assessing, unimpressed that Mark saw every time he looked in a mirror. The second boy was looking at Linda, not the camera, with an expression so protective it made Mark's chest constrict. Can you imagine? Standing in front of 2,000 people and suddenly discovering your entire life has been a lie? The caption read, Linda Davison, with her children Kelly, Harris, and Sandy, 18. Despite her recent diagnosis, Davison says her only focus is ensuring her children's future is secure. Mark's vision tunneled. Everything else, the audience, the stage, the speech he'd rehearsed, the persona he'd spent 2 decades perfecting, disappeared into white noise. Triplets. 19 years ago, Linda had told him she was pregnant, singular, 1 child. One impossible, terrifying, world-altering fact that had sent him spiraling into panic and guilt, and desperate scrambling to figure out how to be a father when he was barely managing to be a functional adult. He'd asked for time, transferred money, promised he'd figure it out, and then she'd vanished. Changed her number, moved without leaving an address, disappeared so completely that after 6 months of searching, Mark had convinced himself she'd made a choice, that she'd decided he wasn't worth the trouble, that maybe she'd never been pregnant at all, just testing him, and he'd failed spectacularly. But she had been pregnant, with three children who looked like him, who had his expressions, his mannerisms, his eyes. This is where everything changes. Mr. Jenkins? The voice came from somewhere far away, muffled and distorted like Mark was underwater. Mr. Jenkins, are you all right? Mark blinked. The conference hall swam back into focus, 2,000 faces, staring at him with varying degrees of concern and confusion. He was still standing at the podium, one hand gripping the edge hard enough that his knuckles had gone white. How long had he been standing there? His voice came out wrong, too rough, stripped of the polished confidence that was supposed to be unshakable. I apologize, there's been an emergency. He didn't wait for a response, didn't offer explanation or reassurance, or any of the corporate damage control his PR team would have scripted in 30 seconds flat. Mark simply walked off the stage. The murmurs started immediately: confusion, speculation, the rustle of 2,000 people, suddenly uncertain whether they should stay or leave or capture this extremely unusual moment on their phones for posterity. Mark heard none of it. He walked through the backstage area where assistants and tech crew scattered out of his path like he was radioactive, through the service corridor, past the green room where his jacket was still hanging on the back of a chair. James caught up with him halfway to the parking garage. Mark? What the hell? Not now. You just walked out of the biggest keynote of the quarter. I've got 3 board members calling. The press is losing their minds. And, James, Mark stopped walking, turned to face his COO, his oldest friend, the man who'd been there since the beginning, when they were 2 idiots with a business plan and more audacity than sense. Not now. Something in Mark's expression made James stop mid-sentence. They'd worked together for 12 years. James had seen Mark navigate hostile takeovers, market crashes, smear campaigns, and stockholder revolts without breaking a sweat. He'd never seen him look like this. Lost, shattered, completely unmoored. What happened? James asked quietly. Mark's hand shook as he pulled up the article on his tablet and turned the screen toward James. James read it, looked at the photo, looked back at Mark. Oh my God, he breathed. Are those mine? The word came out strangled. They're mine. You're sure? Mark almost laughed, except nothing about this was remotely funny. Look at them, he said hoarsely. Look at their faces and tell me they're not mine. James looked, really looked. And then he said the thing Mark hadn't wanted to hear, but knew was true. She never told you. It wasn't a question. Mark shook his head. She said she was pregnant, 19 years ago. 1 baby. I panicked. I was 24, broke, trying to launch the company. Terrified I'd screw it all up, I asked for time, transferred money, told her I'd figure it out. He swallowed hard. She disappeared. I searched for months. Eventually I thought, I convinced myself she'd made a choice. That she didn't want me involved. I told myself it was for the best. But there were 3, James said slowly. 3. Mark's voice cracked. She raised 3 children alone for 18 years while I was building an empire. And now she's dying, and they don't even know I exist. The parking garage was cold, echoing, empty except for the 2 of them, and the weight of revelation that felt like it might crush Mark where he stood. What are you going to do? James asked. Mark looked down at the photo again, at Kelly's defiant chin, at Harris's protective posture, at Sandy's careful, assessing expression. 3 strangers with his face. 3 children who'd lived entire lives without him. 3 people he should have known, should have loved, should have been there for, and hadn't, because he'd never been given the chance. Or because Linda had decided he didn't deserve one. The anger came then, sudden and white-hot, cutting through the shock. She'd kept them from him, made the choice for all of them, let him believe for 19 years that he'd failed 1 child when in reality he'd never even known about 3. But underneath the anger was something worse. Grief. Not for Linda, not yet, even though the article said terminal illness and Mark's brain couldn't quite process what that meant, but for the 18 years he'd lost. First steps he'd never seen. First words he'd never heard. Birthdays, and scraped knees, and school plays, and every tiny infinite moment that made up a childhood. Gone. All of it, gone. And he couldn't get it back. Mark, James said carefully. What are you going to do? Mark closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the decision was already made. Find her, he said. Find Linda Davison. Now. And then what? Mark looked at the photo one more time. At the children he'd never known. At the woman who'd kept them secret. Then, he said quietly, I'm going to ask her why she thought I didn't deserve to know I had a family. His voice didn't crack this time. But his hands were still shaking when he got in the car. And as his driver pulled out of the parking garage, Mark Jenkins, billionaire CEO, market disruptor, man who'd built a $15 billion empire through sheer force of will, finally understood the difference between success and wholeness. He'd spent 19 years building everything, and lost the only things that mattered. Children he'd never held. A family he'd never known. A life he might never get the chance to be part of. The car merged onto the highway, heading toward an address Mark's assistant had pulled in under 3 minutes, because money could find anything. Except lost time. Except forgiveness. Except the answer to the question that was tearing him apart from the inside. Would they even want him? Mark didn't know. But for the first time in 19 years, not knowing felt like drowning. And there was no empire big enough to save him from that. The soup had been simmering for 45 minutes, filling the small kitchen with the smell of chicken broth and vegetables that Linda had learned to stretch across 3 growing teenagers and 2 leftover lunches. Normal. That's what tonight needed to be. One last ordinary Tuesday, before the world tilted sideways, and nothing would ever be ordinary again. Linda stirred the pot with the wooden spoon Kelly had made in 8th grade shop class, the handle slightly crooked, the bowl sanded smooth by years of use. Behind her, the triplets occupied their usual territories. Kelly at the kitchen table, with her laptop open. Probably arguing with someone on a college forum about financial aid requirements. Harris sprawled on the living room floor with his calc textbook, headphones in, foot tapping to whatever music he thought would help him focus. Sandy curled in the corner of the couch with a library book, present but separate, the way she always was. Her whole world, contained in 900 square feet of rented space. 6 months to memorize it. Mom, seriously, why does Harris always eat the bread right before grocery day? Kelly's voice carried the particular exasperation of an oldest sibling by 4 minutes, who took that responsibility like a sacred duty. Because I have a fast metabolism and you're just jealous, Harris called back without looking up from his textbook. You don't even know what metabolism means. Neither do you. I'm pre-med track. You absolute. Language, Linda said automatically, though her lips curved slightly. This was normal. This bickering that meant safety, meant home, meant they still believed tomorrow would look like today. She wanted to freeze this moment, bottle it, keep it somewhere safe for when she was gone, and they needed to remember that once upon a time, their biggest problem was bread. The knock came at 7:47 p.m. 3 sharp raps against the front door. Linda's hand stilled on the spoon. She knew the way prey knows when a predator is close, the way the air changes before a storm, that this was the moment everything broke. Pay attention to this, because what happens in the next few minutes will rewrite 19 years of history. I'll get it, Sandy said, already unfolding from the couch. No. The word came out sharper than Linda intended. All three triplets looked up, sensing something in her tone they couldn't name. I've got it. Linda set down the spoon, wiped her hands on the dish towel, and walked to the door with her heart hammering against her ribs hard enough to hurt. She knew who it was before she opened it. 19 years could pass. Empires could rise. Boys could become billionaires. But some things, the specific weight of a person's presence, the way they took up space, those things didn't change. Linda opened the door. And there was Mark Jenkins. Not the polished CEO from the Forbes covers. Not the man in the $1,000 suit delivering keynotes to rooms full of people who hung on his every word. Just Mark. Hair disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it, tie loosened, jacket gone. Eyes red-rimmed and wild, with something between rage and devastation. He looked like someone had reached into his chest and rearranged everything without asking permission. He looked exactly how Linda felt 3 days ago when Dr. Patel said 6 months. Linda. Her name came out like he'd been holding it in his mouth for 19 years, waiting for permission to speak it aloud. She should have said something, should have stepped outside, closed the door behind her, created a barrier between her past and her present. Instead, she just stood there, gripping the doorknob so hard her knuckles went white. "You're sick," Mark said, and it wasn't a question. Linda's composure, the same careful control that had carried her through diagnosis and parking lot breakdown, and 45 minutes of pretending everything was fine, cracked. "Mom?" Kelly's voice came from behind her, concerned and slightly suspicious. "Who is it?" Mark's eyes moved past Linda, landing on Kelly. Linda watched him stop breathing. Watched recognition hit him like a physical blow. Watched 19 years of walls come down in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "Inside," Linda said quietly, "now." It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. Because if this was happening, and clearly, inevitably, it was, then it would happen on her terms, in her space, where she still had some semblance of control. Mark followed her in. The triplets had all stood up now, drawn by the tension that filled the room like smoke. Harris had pulled out his headphones. Sandy had closed her book. Kelly had positioned herself slightly in front of her brothers, protective instinct activated. They were staring at Mark. And Mark was staring back. His expression doing something complicated that Linda had no name for, cataloging features, maybe, or seeing ghosts, or trying to reconcile the impossible fact of 3 human beings who shouldn't exist but did. "Everyone sit down," Linda said. Nobody moved. "Sit down." The triplets sat, though Kelly looked mutinous about it. Mark remained standing, rooted to the spot like someone had nailed his feet to the floor. Linda closed the front door. And then, because there was no good way to do this, no script for detonating your children's lives, she said, the thing that would change everything. "This is Mark Jenkins." Her voice was steady, clinical, like she was introducing a coworker, not the man whose DNA lived in 3 people currently staring at him with varying degrees of confusion. "He's your father." The silence that followed was so complete, Linda could hear the soup still bubbling on the stove. Harris spoke first, his voice dangerously quiet. "What?" Kelly had gone pale, eyes darting between Mark and Linda like she was solving an equation that didn't make sense. Sandy said nothing at all. Just watched Mark with those unsettling, too knowing eyes that missed nothing. Have you ever watched someone's world collapse in real time? These 3 kids just found out their father, the man they've spent 18 years not knowing, has been alive this whole time. If this hits different for you, if you've ever discovered a truth that rewrote your entire past, leave a comment below. Tell me your story, because what we're witnessing here is just the beginning. And you need to see how this family puts itself back together. Hit like if you're feeling this moment, because it's about to get even more intense. Mark's voice when it came was wrecked. "You never told me there were 3. "No," Linda said. "I didn't." "Why?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Linda looked at her children, brilliant, complicated, wholly themselves, and then back at Mark. "Because I was 25 and terrified," she said, each word precise and deliberate. "Because you were 24, and building a company that required every ounce of focus you had. Because when I told you I was pregnant singular, one child, you panicked. Mark flinched. You transferred money like that would solve it. Linda continued, voice gaining strength. Asked for time like I had it to give. And I looked at you, really looked at you, and I saw someone drowning. Someone who wasn't ready. Someone who might have stayed out of obligation and resented us for it. So you made the choice for me, Mark said. Yes, you took my children. I took nothing. Linda's voice cut like a blade. You didn't know they existed to take. I found out I was carrying triplets 2 weeks after you asked for time. 2 weeks after watching you spiral, because the thought of one baby terrified you. She took a breath. So I made a calculation. Better to raise them without you than watch you love them halfway. Better to give them stability than subject them to someone who stayed because he had to, not because he wanted to. You don't know that I would've, don't I? Linda's laugh was bitter. Mark, you asked me to wait, to give you time to figure out how to be a father while building an empire. What do you think would have happened when I told you it was 3? Would you have stayed? Or would you have run? Mark opened his mouth, closed it, because they both knew the answer. 20-year-old Mark Jenkins, terrified and overwhelmed and desperate to prove himself, would have drowned under the weight of triplets. 44-year-old Mark Jenkins knew that. Hated it, but knew it. So what now? Kelly's voice was ice. You show up here, in our house, and what? Expect us to just what? Be grateful? Call you dad? Mark turned to her, and Linda saw something shift in his expression. Saw him really see Kelly not as a concept, not as a shock, but as a person. Sharp-edged and fierce, and protecting her family the way Linda had taught her. No, he said quietly. I don't expect anything. Good, Harris said, his poet's voice steady, despite the tremor in his hands. Because you don't get to just appear and disrupt everything. Sandy still hadn't spoken. Just watched. Waiting. Mark looked at Linda, and something in his expression made her chest tighten. Why now? He asked. Why tell me after 19 years? This was it. The truth that would hurt more than absence ever had. Linda met his eyes, those same eyes looking back at her from 3 faces she loved more than breathing, and said it plainly. Because I'm dying, and I don't have the luxury of keeping secrets anymore. The words landed like stones in still water. Mark's face did something terrible. The triplets went rigid, and Linda knew they'd process that later, would have questions she couldn't answer tonight, would need reassurances she couldn't give. But right now, this moment belonged to Mark, to the reckoning he'd earned. 6 months, Linda said, her voice gentler now. Maybe less. I found out 3 days ago, and the only thing I could think was that my children deserve to know their father before I'm gone. Mark's hands were shaking. What do you want from me? He asked, voice breaking. And Linda Davison, who'd spent 19 years carrying everything alone, looked at the man she'd loved and left, and said the thing she'd never planned to say. My children deserve to know where they come from, who they are, what lives in their blood beyond my side of the story. She paused. They don't need your money. They don't need a savior. They need a man who stays. Can you be that? Mark looked at Kelly's defiance, Harris's guardedness, Sandy's careful assessment. 3 strangers with his face. 3 people he should have known. 3 chances he might never get back. I don't know, he said honestly, but I'm going to try. It wasn't enough. It was nowhere close to enough, but it was true. And truth, Linda had learned, was all they had left. Mark stayed. Not because Linda invited him, not because the triplets looked even remotely welcoming. He stayed because leaving felt like running, and he'd already spent 19 years running from something he didn't know existed. The soup had gone cold on the stove. Nobody seemed to care. They'd migrated to the living room in that awkward, funeral-like arrangement of people who didn't know what to do with catastrophic information. Linda sat in the armchair, the only real chair, the one with the cushion that had molded to her shape over years of use. The triplets occupied the couch like a unified front, Kelly in the middle, Harris and Sandy flanking her like guards. Mark stood. There was nowhere else for him. No space carved out in this home he'd never seen, this life he'd never touched. So, Kelly said, voice sharp enough to draw blood, you're a billionaire. It wasn't admiration. It was an accusation. Yes, Mark said. And you built some kind of tech empire. Logistics technology. Yes. Must be nice. Kelly's smile had edges. Meanwhile, Mom worked doubles at a diner to keep us fed. Wore shoes with holes in them for 6 months, because Harris needed new cleats. Skipped meals so we could have seconds. Each word landed like a stone. Mark felt them hit. Now here's what you need to understand. Kelly wasn't just being cruel. She was protecting the only parent she'd ever known. And Mark, he was about to prove whether he deserved to be in this room at all. Kelly, Linda said quietly. No. Kelly stood up, and Mark saw himself in the set of her jaw, the way she squared her shoulders before a fight. He gets to hear this. You want to know what the last 18 years looked like? They looked like garage sale clothes and scholarship applications, and Mom crying in the bathroom when she thought we couldn't hear because the power bill was late again. I didn't know. Mark started. Exactly, Kelly's voice cracked. You didn't know, and whose fault is that? The question hung there, unanswerable. Because Mark could say Linda's she was the one who'd disappeared, who'd kept them secret, who'd made the choice for everyone. But Kelly wasn't asking about fault. She was asking about absence. And absence, Mark was learning, didn't care about blame. I would have stayed, he said quietly. If I'd known. If she'd told me. I would have figured it out. Would you? Harris spoke for the first time since Mark had entered, his voice carrying the particular skepticism of someone who'd learned early not to trust easy promises. You were building a company, sleeping in your office, chasing investors. Would you really have chosen 3 babies over your empire? Remember this question, because the answer Mark gives right now will determine everything that comes after. Mark wanted to say yes, wanted to insist that of course he would have chosen them, that family mattered more than money, that he wasn't the kind of man who'd abandon his children. But Harris was watching him with eyes that saw too much the same eyes Mark had inherited from his own father, the geneticist who'd loved research more than his son, and Mark couldn't lie. I don't know, he admitted. 20-year-old me was terrified and selfish, and convinced the company was the only thing that mattered. I'd like to think I would have risen to it, but honestly, I might not have. The honesty seemed to surprise Harris more than any defense would have. At least you're not pretending, Harris said after a moment. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. Sandy still hadn't said a word. She sat on the far end of the couch, book abandoned in her lap, watching Mark the way scientists watch specimens, under glass cataloging, analyzing, waiting for him to reveal what he really was. Her silence was more unnerving than Kelly's anger or Harris's skepticism, because Mark had no idea what she was thinking. Sandy, Linda said gently, you can ask him questions. It's okay. Sandy's gaze shifted to her mother, then back to Mark. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet, Mark had to lean forward to hear it. Are you going to leave when she dies? The question gutted him. Can you imagine being asked that by someone who just learned you exist? Someone who's already calculating how much more loss they can survive? Because that's what Sandy had been waiting to know. Not who he was, or why he'd been absent, or whether he had money. Just whether he'd stay. Whether he was worth the risk of knowing? Mark knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the couch, with Sandy's careful, assessing stare. I don't know how to be a father, he said, speaking directly to her, to all 3 of them. I don't know your favorite foods, or what makes you laugh, or how you like your coffee, or any of the 1,000 tiny things a parent should know. I can't get back the years I missed. I can't undo the fact that I wasn't there. He took a breath. But I'm here now, and if you'll let me, I'd like to learn who you are, not because I have to, not out of obligation or guilt, or some billionaire savior fantasy, but because you're mine. And I've spent 19 years building things that don't matter. I'd like to spend whatever time I have left building something that does. Sandy held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, I like my coffee black, no sugar. It was the smallest opening. Mark took it like a lifeline. Black, no sugar, he repeated, committing it to memory like it was the most important piece of information he'd ever learned. Because it was. Kelly made a sound that might have been a scoff, or might have been something softer. I don't drink coffee, she said. Tea, English breakfast, 2 sugars, no milk. Harris hesitated, then, whatever's cheapest. I'm not picky. And just like that, Mark had 3 pieces of information that felt more valuable than every Forbes profile ever written about him. This is what changing looks like. Not dramatic declarations, just small truths, shared in a living room that smells like cold soup and feels like the edge of something terrifying and necessary. Linda was watching from the armchair, and when Mark glanced at her, he saw something that made his chest tighten. She looked smaller than she had 3 days ago. Thinner, like whatever was growing inside her was already claiming territory, already taking what little she had left. She caught him staring. "I'm fine," she said, though they both knew it was a lie. "Mom," Kelly said, the anger draining from her voice, replaced by worry. "You should eat something." "I'm not hungry. You haven't eaten since breakfast." "Kelly." "Don't Kelly me." But Kelly's voice was gentle now, stripped of the sharp edges she'd used on Mark. "Please. Just soup. Half a bowl." Linda looked like she wanted to argue. Then she nodded, and Kelly disappeared into the kitchen. The silence that followed was different, less hostile, more exhausted. Mark wanted to help, to do something useful, but he had no idea what his role was here. Visitor? Intruder? Father? None of the labels fit. Harris was looking at him again, that analytical poet's gaze that missed nothing. "You said you built logistics technology," Harris said. "Yeah. What does that even mean?" Mark could have given the elevator pitch, the one he'd perfected for investors and journalists and board meetings, revenue streams and market disruption and scalable solutions. Instead, he said, "We move things from where they are to where they need to be, efficiently, predictably. So businesses don't waste time or money or resources." Harris considered that. "Sounds boring." Mark almost laughed. "It is," he admitted. "Most days it's spreadsheets and logistics algorithms and meetings about meetings. But it works, and it pays for, well, everything." "Is that supposed to impress us?" Harris asked, but there was curiosity beneath the challenge now. "No," Mark said. "It's supposed to explain why I was so obsessed with it 19 years ago that I couldn't see past it, and why that was the worst mistake I ever made." Kelly returned with a bowl of soup and a spoon, setting it on the small table beside Linda's chair. Linda picked up the spoon with hands that trembled slightly, so slightly that if Mark hadn't been watching, he might have missed it. But he was watching, and he saw the careful way she steadied her grip, saw the concentration it took to lift the spoon to her mouth, saw Kelly watching too, worry etched into every line of her face. 6 months, Mark thought, maybe less. The knowledge sat in his chest like broken glass. "You should go," Linda said after a few spoonfuls, setting the bowl aside. "This is a lot for everyone. We all need time to process." Mark wanted to argue, wanted to stay, to prove something, to make up for 19 years in one evening. But Linda was right. This was too much, too fast, too overwhelming. "Okay," he said, standing. "But I'm coming back, if that's all right." Linda looked at the triplets. Kelly shrugged, which wasn't permission, but wasn't refusal either. Harris said nothing, which Mark was learning to read as cautious openness. Sandy met his eyes and said, "Tomorrow, 6 p.m., bring dinner, not expensive, just food." It was a test. Mark knew it was a test. 6 p.m., he confirmed. "What do you like?" "Pizza," Sandy said, "but not from the fancy place downtown. From Angelo's on 5th Street. They give you extra napkins, and the crust is good even when it's cold." Mark had never heard of Angelo's. Had probably driven past it 100 times without noticing. "Angelo's on 5th, he repeated. 6 p.m. As he walked to the door, Linda followed, moving slower than she had when she'd let him in. "Mark," she said quietly, voice too low for the triplets to hear. "They don't need a billionaire. They need a man who stays." The words hit him harder than Kelly's anger, harder than Harris's skepticism, harder than Sandy's careful silence. Because Linda was right. Money wouldn't save them from grief. Success wouldn't fill the hole she'd leave behind. Power wouldn't teach them how to keep living when the person who'd held everything together was gone. They needed someone present, someone real. Someone who showed up with cheap pizza and learned how they took their coffee and didn't run when things got hard. "I know," Mark said. And this time, maybe for the first time in 19 years, he understood what that meant. He left before he could see Linda's hands shake again. Before he could watch Kelly's composure crack. Before the weight of everything he'd missed could bury him completely. But as Mark drove away from the small rental house with the porch light on, and 3 strangers with his face inside, He made a promise he had no idea how to keep. He would stay, even when it hurt, even when they hated him, even when staying felt impossible. Because leaving running, hiding, building empires to avoid the messy reality of being human had cost him everything that mattered. And he wouldn't make that mistake again. The worst part? It gets so much harder before it gets better. But if Mark can survive what's coming, he might just become the father these kids deserve. Mark showed up at 5:47 p.m. with 4 large pizzas from Angelo's, and no idea what he was doing. The boxes were warm against his hands. The smell of cheap mozzarella and oregano filled his car, a far cry from the restaurants where meals cost more than most people's weekly groceries and came on plates too pretty to eat from. He'd canceled 3 meetings to be here, rescheduled a board presentation, told James to handle the West Coast expansion call without him, which had resulted in a 10-minute argument that ended with James saying, "You're really doing this?" and Mark answering, "I have to." Because he did. For the first time in 19 years, something mattered more than the empire. Kelly answered the door, took one look at the pizza boxes, and said, "You brought 4? I didn't know how hungry everyone was," Mark said, suddenly uncertain. "Or if you had preferences, or if Linda could eat." "She's having a bad day," Kelly interrupted. Voice flat in that way that meant she was holding something back. "Chemo was yesterday. She's trying to pretend she's fine, but she threw up twice this morning and hasn't left her room since noon." Mark's stomach dropped. "Should I leave?" "No." Kelly stepped aside, letting him in. "She made us promise we'd give you a chance. So, we're giving you a chance." It didn't sound like a gift. It sounded like an obligation. The house felt different than it had the night before. Quieter, heavier, like illness had moved in and claimed space. Harris was at the kitchen table with his laptop, not looking up when Mark entered. Sandy sat cross-legged on the floor by the couch, sketchpad balanced on her knees, pencil moving in quick, practice strokes. "Pizza's here," Kelly announced to no one in particular. Harris finally glanced up. "Angelo's?" "Angelo's," Mark confirmed. Something in Harris's expression softened fractionally. "You actually listened." "I said I would. People say a lot of things." The words hung there, heavy with 18 years of broken promises Mark had never made, but somehow inherited responsibility for anyway. He set the pizzas on the small kitchen counter. There was barely room between the dish rack and the coffee maker that looked older than the Triplets. "Is your mom should I?" Mark didn't know how to finish the question. "She's resting," Kelly said, already pulling plates from the cabinet. "We'll bring her a slice later. If she can keep it down." The casual way she said it, "if she can keep it down," made Mark's chest constrict. This was their reality now. Measuring their mother's health in whether food stayed down, whether she could get out of bed, whether the tremor in her hands was worse than yesterday. They ate in near silence. Mark tried to think of things to say, questions that wouldn't sound invasive, observations that wouldn't sound patronizing, but everything died in his throat. Harris took 3 slices and ate them methodically, eyes on his laptop screen. Sandy nibbled at the crust, still drawing. Kelly watched Mark like she was waiting for him to fail some test he didn't know he was taking. But here's the thing about becoming a parent: you fail constantly. The question is whether you keep showing up anyway. "So," Mark finally said, because the silence was suffocating. "Kelly, your mom mentioned pre-med track?" Kelly's eyes narrowed. "Yeah. That's impressive. What schools are you looking at?" "Whichever ones I can afford," she said bluntly, "which is basically state schools with good scholarship programs. Maybe community college for prerequisites if the financial aid doesn't come through." "You could," Mark stopped himself. "I could what?" Kelly's voice was sharp. "Accept money from you? Let the billionaire swoop in and save us? Is that how this works?" "I was just going to say, you could apply anywhere," Mark said carefully. "Money shouldn't limit your options." "But it does." Kelly set down her pizza. "It's limited every option we've ever had. You don't get to show up now and pretend that's fixable." Mark had no response to that. Because she was right. He couldn't undo 18 years of struggle with a checkbook. Couldn't erase the nights Linda had cried over bills, or the shoes with holes, or the sacrifices that had shaped who these kids were. Money was the easy part. Everything else was impossible. "What are you drawing?" Mark asked Sandy, desperate to shift focus. Sandy looked up, hesitated, then turned the sketch pad around. It was a portrait. Linda. Not as she was now diminished, exhausted, dying, but as she must have been years ago. Younger, stronger, smiling in that slight, knowing way she had. The detail was extraordinary. Every line of her face rendered with the kind of precision that came from years of careful observation. "That's beautiful," Mark said, and meant it. Sandy pulled the pad back against her chest. She hates sitting still for portraits. "So I draw from memory. How long have you been drawing?" "Since I could hold a pencil." "Are you thinking about art school?" Sandy's expression shuddered. "Art school costs money. I'll probably just get a regular job." "But if money wasn't—" "It is," Sandy said quietly. "It always is." And there it was again. The wall Mark couldn't scale with good intentions, or newfound paternal instincts, or billionaire solutions. These kids had been shaped by scarcity, by pragmatism, by learning early that dreams were luxuries and survival was the goal. He couldn't relate to that, couldn't fix it, couldn't do anything except sit there feeling useless while they ate cheap pizza in a house that smelled like illness. Harris closed his laptop suddenly. "You said you'd stay," he said, looking directly at Mark for the first time since he'd arrived. "What does that even mean?" "You have a company to run. Meetings. Deals. Whatever billionaires do." "I'm restructuring," Mark said. "To what?" "I don't know yet," Mark admitted. "But James, my COO, can handle day-to-day operations. I'll be available for critical decisions. But I don't need to be physically present for every meeting." "So you're going to work remotely," Harris said flatly. "Partially. And when something urgent comes up, when a deal requires your attention, what happens to us then?" This is where most fathers would make promises they can't keep. Watch what Mark does instead. Mark opened his mouth to say that wouldn't happen, that he'd made a commitment, that they came first, now. But Harris's eyes were too knowing, too familiar with the math of broken promises. "I'm going to try," Mark said instead. "That's all I can offer. I'm going to try, and sometimes I'll probably fail, and you'll have every right to be angry when I do." Harris studied him for a long moment. "Then, at least you're not lying about it." It was the same acknowledgement as before. Not forgiveness. Not trust. Just recognition that Mark wasn't pretending this would be easy. A sound from down the hallway made them all freeze. A door opening. Slow footsteps. Linda appeared in the doorway to the living room, one hand braced against the wall for balance. She'd changed into clean clothes, sweatpants, and an oversized sweater, but her skin had a grayish tint that made Mark's throat tighten. "You came," she said to Mark. "I said I would." "People say a lot of things," she echoed Harris's words, then smiled faintly. "But you brought Angelo's. That counts for something." Kelly was already up, guiding Linda to the armchair, arranging pillows behind her back. "Mom, you should be resting." "I've been resting all day," Linda said, though her voice was thinner than it had been yesterday, scraped raw. "I wanted to see." She trailed off, gaze moving between Mark and the triplets. Wanted to see them together, Mark realized. Wanted to see if this impossible thing she'd set in motion was working. "Pizza's still warm," Sandy said quietly, already moving toward the kitchen. Mark watched as the triplets shifted into a choreographed routine they'd clearly perfected. Kelly adjusting Linda's position, Harris grabbing the throw blanket from the couch, Sandy returning with a single slice on a plate and a glass of water. They moved around their mother like satellites, orbiting her gravity. And Mark stood uselessly to the side. An outsider in a family that had learned long ago how to function without him. "Sit," Linda said, gesturing to the space Harris had vacated. "You're hovering." Mark sat. Linda took a small bite of pizza, chewed carefully, swallowed with obvious effort. "Tell me something," she said after a moment. "Something about your life that has nothing to do with work or money." Mark's mind went blank. Because what did his life contain besides work and money? Board meetings and acquisitions and market projections and the endless pursuit of growth for growth's sake? "I don't," he started, then stopped. Linda was watching him with something that might have been pity. "You built an empire," she said softly. "But what did you build for yourself?" The question gutted him, because the answer was nothing. He'd built nothing for himself. No hobbies. No close friendships outside of James, who he mostly saw in conference rooms. No Sunday morning routines or favorite coffee shops, or small joys that made life worth living beyond the next deal. He'd optimized everything. and in the process, had optimized himself into someone with nothing to offer except money and absence. "I'll figure it out," Mark said. Voice rough. Linda nodded, like she'd expected that answer. Like she'd seen right through him from the beginning and was just waiting for him to catch up. The evening dissolved into awkward silence, punctuated by small talk that went nowhere. Kelly excused herself to study. Harris retreated to his room with headphones. Sandy stayed on the floor, drawing, present, but separate. And Linda, pale, exhausted, visibly struggling, mediated without defending anyone. Just watched Mark fumble through attempting connection and fail in ways both small and significant. At 8:30, Mark stood to leave. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. "If you want," Kelly said from the hallway, voice carefully neutral. "I want." As Mark headed for the door, Sandy appeared beside him. Silent. "Watching." "Hallway," she said quietly. "Outside." Mark followed her out the front door, onto the small porch where a motion sensor light flickered on. Sandy crossed her arms, and in the harsh overhead light, she looked older than 18. Looked like someone who'd been forced to grow up too fast. "You keep showing up," she said. "I will. Mom gets sicker every day. The chemo makes her exhausted. Some days she can't get out of bed. Soon, it'll be worse." Sandy's voice was steady, clinical. "And when she's gone, it'll just be us. 3 kids you don't know, who don't know you, who don't trust you. I know. So here's what I need to know." Sandy met his eyes. And Mark saw fear beneath a careful control. "When it gets hard, when we're grieving and angry and impossible to deal with, are you going to leave?" It was the same question she'd asked the first night. But this time, it felt different. More urgent, more real. Because Linda was getting sicker. Because time was running out. Because soon Sandy's worst fear would come true. And the only question was whether Mark would still be there when it did. "No," Mark said. "I'm not leaving." "Promise me." Sandy's voice cracked. "Promise me you won't leave when she's gone." Mark looked at this girl, this stranger with his eyes and his stubborn chin, and made the most important promise of his life. "I swear. No matter what happens, no matter how hard it gets, I'm staying." Sandy held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once and went back inside. Mark stood on the porch alone, the weight of that promise settling into his bones. He'd spent 19 years making promises to investors and boards and shareholders. Promises he'd kept because his reputation depended on it. This was different. Promises are easy to make, but staying, that costs everything. If you've ever made a promise that terrified you, if you've ever committed to something knowing you might fail, but trying anyway, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because what Mark is about to learn will break him before it rebuilds him. And those of us watching, we need to witness what love looks like when it refuses to quit. Subscribe if you believe some promises are worth keeping, even when they're impossible. The hardest part of this story is still ahead. This promise would cost him everything he'd built. And for the first time, Mark Jenkins understood that some things were worth the price. Linda called Mark on a Thursday morning while he was in a meeting he didn't care about, discussing quarterly projections that felt increasingly meaningless. His phone lit up with her name. He answered before the second ring. "Can you come?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, thin and worn in a way that made his pulse spike. "Not tonight. Now. Just you." Mark was already standing, already grabbing his jacket, while James stared at him from across the conference table. "I'm on my way," Mark said. He didn't apologize to the room, didn't explain, just left 6 executives sitting there, and drove 20 minutes across town to the small rental house that had become the center of his entire world. Something's happening, something Linda needs to say before time runs out, and you need to hear this. Linda answered the door herself, which surprised him. Kelly usually intercepted visitors like a guard dog, but the house was quiet, empty. "The kids are at school," Linda said, reading his expression. "I wanted to talk to you alone, before I can't anymore." The words landed like a physical blow. Before I can't anymore. Linda looked smaller than she had even a week ago. The sweater hung loose on her frame. Her cheekbones stood out too sharply. The tremor in her hands was constant now. No longer something she could hide. "Come sit," she said, leading him not to the living room, but down the hallway to her bedroom. Mark had never been in this room. It was small, spare, functional. A double bed with a faded quilt. A dresser with photos of the triplets at various ages, covering every surface. A nightstand with pill bottles, arranged in careful rows. A glass of water. A notebook. Linda sat on the edge of the bed, patting the space beside her. Mark sat. "I'm getting worse faster than they expected," Linda said without preamble. "Dr. Patel says maybe 6 weeks, maybe less." The number hit Mark in the chest. 6 weeks. Not 6 months. 6 weeks to become a father to 3 people who barely knew him. 6 weeks before Linda was gone and he was all they had left. "I need to tell you something," Linda continued, her gaze fixed on her hands. "And I need you to just listen. Can you do that?" "Yes." She took a breath that sounded like it hurt. "I never hated you," Linda said quietly. "I want you to know that. When I left, when I kept them from you, it wasn't because I thought you were a bad person. It was because I was terrified." Mark stayed silent, though every instinct wanted to interrupt, to defend, to ask questions she might not have strength to answer. "You were 24 years old, with dreams the size of buildings you couldn't afford to enter," Linda continued, a faint smile touching her lips. "You used to draw business plans on napkins at 3 in the morning and tell me about the world you were going to change, and I loved that about you. Loved watching you believe in something impossible and chase it anyway." She paused, swallowing with effort. "But when I told you I was pregnant, I watched something in you break. You didn't say it, but I saw it, the terror. The calculation of everything you'd have to give up. And when I found out 2 weeks later that it was triplets." Linda's voice cracked. "I couldn't do it. Couldn't watch you choose between your dreams and us. Couldn't watch you resent them for existing. So I made the choice for you. I took them and I left, and I convinced myself it was mercy." "Linda, I'm not finished." She looked at him then, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I was wrong. I know that now. I robbed you of 18 years with your children because I was too scared to trust you. Too scared to find out if you'd be strong enough. And I'm sorry for that. Sorrier than I have words for." Mark's throat was tight, aching. "But here's what else I need you to know." Linda reached over to the nightstand, pulling the notebook from beneath the pill bottles. "I wrote you letters. For years. Whenever something happened with the kids that I thought you should know. First words, first steps, first day of kindergarten. Every milestone you missed." She held out the notebook. Mark took it with shaking hands. "I never sent them," Linda said, "because by the time I thought maybe I should, so much time had passed that it felt cruel. What would it solve? What would it change except making you feel guilty for something you didn't even know about?" Mark opened the notebook. The first page was dated 19 years ago. "Dear Mark, they're 1 year old today. Kelly took her first steps this morning, 4 of them, before she fell on her bottom and laughed like it was the funniest thing in the world. Harris clapped for her. Sandy just watched with that serious expression she always has, like she's taking notes for later. I wonder if you would have been here for this, if I'd told you about all 3 of them. If I'd given you the chance. I wonder if you think about me anymore. I wonder if I made the right choice." Mark couldn't read anymore through the tears blurring his vision. "Why are you showing me this now?" he asked, voice breaking. "Because I want you to know them," Linda said. "Really know them. Not just who they are now, but who they've always been. Kelly was born 4 minutes before the boys and took that responsibility like a sacred calling. She's been trying to take care of everyone since she could talk. Sometimes she forgets she's allowed to need help too." Linda paused, gathering strength. Harris hides his poetry notebooks because his 8th grade teacher told him creative writing wasn't practical. He's been afraid of wanting impractical things ever since, but he writes every night. Beautiful, devastating things he doesn't think anyone sees. "And Sandy?" Mark asked quietly. "Sandy watches everything, processes everything. She's been the emotional barometer of this family since she was 5 years old. She knows when I'm lying about being okay, knows when Kelly's overwhelmed, knows when Harris is pretending to be fine. And she carries all of it without complaint." Linda's hands were shaking harder now. "They're going to need different things from you. Kelly will need someone who sees her as more than a caretaker. Harris will need permission to want impractical things. Sandy will need someone who stays, even when it's uncomfortable. Can you do that?" "I'll try," Mark said. "I promise, I'll try." That's all I needed to hear. Linda leaned back against the pillows, exhausted from the effort of confession. Mark should have left then. Should have let her rest. Instead, he asked the question that had been burning in his chest since she'd started talking. Did you love me back then? Linda's expression softened into something that looked like grief. Yes, she said simply. I loved the man who laughed on fire escapes and believed in impossible things. I loved the way you looked at the future like it was something you could hold in your hands if you just worked hard enough. She reached out, fingers brushing his arm with feather-light touch. I never stopped loving that version of you. Even when I convinced myself I'd made the right choice. Even when I saw your face on magazine covers and told myself you'd become someone I wouldn't recognize. I did become someone you wouldn't recognize, Mark said quietly. Someone who forgot why any of it mattered. Someone who optimized everything and lost himself in the process. Then find yourself again, Linda whispered. For them, they deserve the man you could have been, the man you still could be. A sound from the hallway made them both freeze. Soft footsteps. Someone had come home early. Mark stood, opening the bedroom door to find all three triplets standing in the hallway, frozen like they'd been caught eavesdropping, which they had been. Kelly's face was wet with tears. Harris looked stricken. Sandy was staring at Linda with an expression that made Mark's heart shatter. How much did you hear? Linda asked, voice steady, despite everything. Enough, Kelly said, then moved past Mark into the room, climbing onto the bed beside her mother with the same instinct that had guided her since she was 4 minutes old. You should have told us. About the letters. About loving him. Would it have changed anything? Linda asked gently. Maybe, Harris said from the doorway. Maybe we would have been less angry. Less body. Less certain I was the villain, Mark finished. Harris nodded. Sandy hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, just watched her mother with those two knowing eyes. Come here, Linda said, extending her hand. Sandy crossed the room, taking her mother's hand like it might break. I'm dying, Linda said, stating it plainly for maybe the first time in front of all of them together. Sooner than we thought. And when I'm gone, you three are going to need to decide if you'll give your father a real chance. Mom, Kelly's voice cracked. Let me finish. Linda squeezed Kelly's hand, then Sandy's, looking at Harris until he came closer too. Mark isn't perfect. He's going to mess up. Probably a lot. He's going to miss things he shouldn't miss, and say the wrong thing at the wrong time, and fail in ways both small and large. She looked at Mark then. But he's here, and he's trying. And that's more than I gave him the chance to do 19 years ago. The room was silent except for Kelly's quiet crying. I need you to take care of each other, Linda continued, her voice getting thinner. All four of you. Be patient with each other. Be honest. Be the family I should have let you be from the beginning. Mark knelt beside the bed, close enough to see every line of pain etched into Linda's face. I will take care of them, he said quietly, not as a promise to the room, but as a vow to her. With my life. For the rest of my life. They will never doubt that they matter more than anything I ever built. Linda's eyes met his, and in them, Mark saw forgiveness, release, trust. I know, she whispered, and somehow, she did. Knew that this broken, fumbling, late to everything father would become what they needed. Not because he was ready, but because he finally understood what was worth staying for. The five of them stayed like that, crowded into a too-small bedroom in a house that would soon lose its center until Linda fell asleep with her children around her, and the notebook of unsent letters still clutched in Mark's hands. A record of everything he'd missed, and a map for everything he still had time to learn. Linda lasted 3 more weeks. 3 weeks of Mark showing up every day, sometimes with food, sometimes with nothing but his presence. 3 weeks of the triplets, slowly, grudgingly making space for him in the careful ecosystem they'd built around their dying mother. 3 weeks of learning that being a father meant sitting in hospital waiting rooms at 2 a.m. when Linda's pain got too bad to manage at home. Meant holding Kelly while she cried in the hallway, because watching her mother diminish was unbearable. Meant listening to Harris read poetry aloud because Linda said it helped her breathe easier. Meant sitting in silence with Sandy while she sketched her mother's hands, trying to capture them before they stopped moving. 3 weeks of becoming something Mark had no name for yet. Not quite family, but no longer strangers. On a Tuesday morning in late October, Linda asked Mark to gather the children. Her voice on the phone was papery, translucent, like it might tear if he spoke too loudly. All of them, she said, right now, while I still can. What's about to happen will break you. But it needs to. Because this is how love looks when it refuses to let go. Mark found Kelly at school, pulled her out of chemistry lab over her teacher's protests. Found Harris at the library, where he'd been supposedly studying but actually writing in the notebook he'd finally stopped hiding. Found Sandy in the art room, standing in front of a canvas she'd barely started. They knew. The moment Mark appeared, they knew. Nobody spoke on the drive back to the house. Kelly sat in the front seat, hands clenched in her lap. Harris and Sandy in the back, pressed close to each other, the way they used to do as children when thunderstorms scared them. The hospice nurse met them at the door, her expression professionally compassionate and utterly devastating. "She's lucid," the nurse said quietly, "but you should go in now." Linda was in her bedroom, propped up on pillows that made her look even smaller than she was. The oxygen cannula in her nose. The morphine drip that kept the worst of the pain at bay, but made everything else fuzzy. She smiled when they entered, all four of them, crowding into the doorway like they were afraid to get too close, afraid that crossing the threshold meant admitting this was really happening. "Come here," Linda said, and her voice was stronger than it had been in days, like she'd been saving it for this exact moment. They came. Kelly climbed onto the bed first, taking her mother's left hand. Sandy took the right. Harris sat at the foot of the bed, one hand resting on Linda's ankle, like he needed the physical confirmation she was still here. Mark stood, because he didn't know where he fit yet. "You too," Linda said, eyes finding his. "You're part of this." Mark moved closer, standing beside Kelly, close enough to touch, but not quite touching. "I don't have much time," Linda said plainly. "No euphemisms or gentle metaphors. Maybe hours, maybe less. And I need to say something while I still can." Kelly made a sound like something breaking. "No grand speeches," Linda continued, squeezing Kelly's hand. "I'm too tired for grand speeches. But I need you to listen. All of you." They listened. "You are going to be okay," Linda said, looking at each of her children in turn. "Not right away. Not for a long time. You're going to be angry and lost. And you're going to miss me so much, it feels like drowning. But you will survive this." Sandy's tears fell silently, dripping onto the faded quilt. "Kelly, you are not responsible for holding everyone together. You're allowed to fall apart. You're allowed to need help. Let Mark help you." Kelly shook her head, but Linda's grip tightened. "Let him," she repeated firmly. "He's not me. He'll never be me. But he's here, and he loves you, even if none of you are ready to hear that yet." She turned to Harris. "Right," she said simply. "Every beautiful, impractical, devastating thing you feel. Write it, and don't you dare hide it. The world needs your words." Harris was crying now too, shoulders shaking. "And Sandy." Linda's voice was getting thinner. "You don't have to be the one who understands everything. You don't have to carry everyone else's pain. Draw what you feel. Let it out." Sandy nodded, unable to speak. Finally, Linda looked at Mark. "Take care of them," she said. "Not with money, not by trying to fix everything. Just be there. Show up. Stay. That's all they need." "I will," Mark said, the words scraping his throat raw. "I promise." "I know." Linda smiled, and it was the same slight curve of lips from the hospital photo, from 19 years ago on fire escapes. From every moment Mark had loved her, and lost her, and found her again too late. "Be a family," Linda said, her eyes moving between all four of them. "All of you. Be messy and imperfect and honest with each other. Be the family I should have let you be from the beginning." It wasn't a grand speech. It was a dying wish, plain and clear, and impossible to misunderstand. They stayed with her for 7 more hours, took turns reading to her when she was too tired to talk, played music she'd loved, told stories about memories they'd made together. Kelly fell asleep against her mother's shoulder around 3 p.m. Harris held her hand until his fingers went numb. Sandy drew one last portrait, Linda's face, peaceful, still here but already drifting somewhere else. And Mark stayed because Linda had asked him to, because these children needed to see that he wouldn't leave when things got hard. At 6:42 p.m., Linda's breathing changed, became shallow, irregular. The hospice nurse appeared in the doorway, silent and knowing. Mom? Kelly's voice was small, terrified. Linda's eyes opened one last time. She looked at her children, her whole world, her greatest accomplishment, the 3 people she'd loved more than breathing. And then she looked at Mark. "Thank you," she whispered. For what? Mark would never know. For staying, for trying, for being what they needed even though it came 19 years too late. Linda Davison took one more breath. And then she was gone. Let that sink in. The woman who held everything together is gone. And now 4 people who barely know each other have to figure out how to keep living. The funeral was on a Saturday. 53 people came to remember a woman who'd worked double shifts and raised triplets alone and never complained about how hard it was. Co-workers from the diner. Teachers who'd watched the triplets grow up. Neighbors who'd borrowed sugar and returned casseroles. People whose lives Linda had touched quietly, without fanfare. Just by being someone who showed up and helped, and never expected recognition. Mark stood behind the triplets. Not in front, leading them. Not beside them, like he belonged there yet. Behind. Supporting, but not claiming space that wasn't his. Kelly delivered the eulogy in a voice that shook, but never broke. Talked about strength and sacrifice, and the mother who taught them that love meant showing up even when you were exhausted. Harris read a poem he'd written the night Linda died, devastating and beautiful and raw in ways that made grown adults cry. Sandy didn't speak, but she'd drawn a portrait of Linda that stood on an easel beside the closed casket, and everyone who passed it stopped, stared, saw Linda Davison not as she'd been at the end diminished by illness, but as she'd always been. Fierce, loving, unbreakable. After the service, people approached the triplets with condolences and stories, and promises to be there if they needed anything. Mark stayed behind them, watchful, present, not inserting himself into grief that wasn't his to claim. James had come, standing respectfully to the side, ready to help if needed, but understanding this wasn't about business or boards or the empire Mark had built. As the crowd thinned and people began drifting toward their cars, Sandy turned around. She looked at Mark with eyes that were red and swollen and full of something Mark couldn't quite name. And then slowly, deliberately, she reached for his hand. Her fingers were small and cold and trembling. Mark closed his hand around hers. Kelly noticed first. Her eyes widened slightly. Then her expression crumbled and she reached for Mark too, grabbing his other hand like it was the only solid thing left in a world that had just collapsed. Harris hesitated only a moment before stepping closer, his hand landing on Mark's shoulder. And there, in a cemetery parking lot with autumn leaves falling around them and Linda Davison resting in the ground, 4 people who'd been strangers 7 weeks ago became something else. Not perfect, not healed, but together. This is what family looks like after loss. Messy, broken, but choosing each other anyway. If this story is reminding you of someone you've lost or someone who showed up when you needed them most, comment below and tell me about them. Honor their memory by sharing this story, because Linda's wish is coming true right before our eyes. And if you're still watching, if you've stayed through the tears, then you understand why some stories need to be told. Subscribe, because what happens next, how this fractured family rebuilds itself, that's the part that will restore your faith in second chances. A family born from loss and late second chances, and a dying woman's wish. Mark didn't say anything. Didn't make promises or speeches or try to turn the moment into something more than it was. He just held on. And for the first time since Linda had opened her door 3 weeks ago, Mark Jenkins understood what he'd been building toward his entire life without knowing it. Not an empire. Not success or wealth or recognition. This. 3 people who needed him to stay. 3 people he'd failed before he'd ever known them. 3 people he would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve. "Let's go home," Kelly whispered. And for the first time, Mark knew exactly where that was. The house felt wrong without Linda in it. Not empty, because 4 people still lived there, still moved through rooms and opened cabinets and turned on lights, but wrong in the way a melody sounds when you miss a note. Off balance, incomplete. Mark learned this the first morning he woke up on the couch at 6 a.m. because Kelly's alarm had been going off for 20 minutes and nobody had turned it off. He found her in bed, facing the wall, eyes open but not seeing anything. "Kelly," he said gently from the doorway. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't get up. I can't go to school. I can't pretend everything's normal when she's gone." Mark sat on the edge of her bed, careful not to crowd her. Then don't, he said. Don't go to school. Don't pretend. Just be. Kelly turned to look at him, eyes red and swollen from crying that had probably lasted most of the night. Mom would have made me go, she said. I'm not your mom. I know, Kelly's voice cracked. I know, and that's the problem. I don't know how to do this without her. She always knew what to do. When to push. When to let us fall apart. When to. She couldn't finish. Mark didn't try to fix it with words. Didn't offer platitudes about time healing or Linda watching from above or any of the useless things people had said at the funeral. He just sat there while Kelly cried. And when she was done, when she'd exhausted herself back into that hollow numbness that grief brings, Mark said, "What did your mom make for breakfast?" Kelly blinked, thrown by the question. Usually oatmeal, sometimes eggs if we had them. Toast on Wednesdays, because the bakery did day-old discount. Can you teach me? Mark asked. To make oatmeal? To make it the way she made it, so it tastes like home. Something in Kelly's expression shifted, not quite healing, but softening around the edges. Yeah, she said quietly. I can do that. This is how healing begins. Not with grand gestures, but with oatmeal on a Tuesday morning. They made oatmeal together in the small kitchen, Kelly directing, Mark following instructions like they were critical business plans. Brown sugar, not white. Cinnamon. A pinch of salt Linda had always added that made the difference between bland and comforting. Harris emerged around 7, drawn by the smell. Looked at the oatmeal, at Kelly and Mark standing side by side at the stove. And something in his careful walls cracked. She always hummed while she cooked, Harris said. Some song from before we were born. Never the whole thing. Just the same 8 bars over and over. Do you remember it? Mark asked. Harris hummed a few notes, tentative, uncertain. Kelly picked it up, continued it. And just like that, Linda was in the room with them. Not gone. Not replaced. Just present in the rituals she'd built. The small, ordinary moments that made a house a home. Sandy appeared last, sketchpad clutched to her chest like armor. She didn't say anything, just took the bowl Mark offered and ate standing up, watching them like she was cataloging this new configuration of family to process later. The days that followed were harder than Mark had imagined. There were no instructions for this, no playbook for becoming a father to grieving teenagers who were trying to figure out how to exist in a world without their mother. Mark learned through failure and fumbling and showing up anyway. He learned that Harris needed space in the mornings, but fell apart around midnight when the house was quiet and grief felt loudest. Learned that Kelly would work herself to exhaustion if someone didn't physically stop her, because productivity was the only thing that made her feel like she wasn't drowning. Learned that Sandy processed everything internally until she couldn't anymore, and then she'd disappear into her room and draw for hours, emerging only when she'd made sense of whatever was tearing her apart. He learned that Wednesdays were the hardest because Linda had always been home on Wednesdays. That Kelly folded laundry the exact way Linda had taught her, shirts in thirds, pants lengthwise, and cried every time. That Harris kept his mother's coffee mug on his nightstand, unwashed, because it still smelled faintly of her. That Sandy slept with the lights on now, because darkness felt too much like absence. Mark didn't try to fix any of it. He just stayed. 3 weeks after the funeral, college acceptance letters started arriving. Kelly had been accepted to state school with partial scholarship. Good, but not enough to cover everything. She'd need loans, would need to work part-time, would be in debt before she even started. She stared at the letter for 10 minutes before saying, "It's fine, I'll make it work." Or, Mark said carefully, "You could let me help. I don't need your money. I know you don't need it, but it's there. And I'd like to give it to you, not as some billionaire savior. As your father, who wants you to focus on becoming a doctor instead of working 3 jobs to afford books." Kelly's jaw tightened. "I don't want to owe you. You don't owe me anything. This isn't debt. It's just what parents do. They help their kids, if they can. But you weren't," Kelly stopped herself. "Weren't there." The words hung unspoken between them. "No," Mark agreed quietly. "I wasn't, and I can't change that. But I'm here now, and I'd like to help, if you'll let me." Kelly looked at the acceptance letter. At the scholarship amount, that wasn't quite enough. At the future, she'd been prepared to struggle toward. "Okay," she said finally, voice small. "Okay." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acceptance. A week later, Harris got into a writing program he'd applied to in secret, one of those small, prestigious things that cost more than it should but could change everything if you were good enough. He showed Mark the acceptance letter with trembling hands. "I can't go," Harris said. "It's too expensive. Too impractical." "Mom would have said." "Your mom would have said right," Mark interrupted. "She told you to write. Every beautiful, impractical, devastating thing. Remember?" Harris's eyes filled. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Scared I'm not good enough. Scared I'll waste your money. Scared I'll fail and prove everyone right who said creative writing isn't worth pursuing." Mark thought about 20-year-old him, terrified and desperate to prove himself, chasing an empire because success felt like the only thing that mattered. "I built a $15 billion company," Mark said. "And the day I found out I had 3 children I never knew about, all of it meant nothing. Every dollar, every deal, every success worthless compared to what I'd lost." He met Harris's eyes. "Don't wait 19 years to figure out what matters. If writing matters to you, then it's not impractical. It's essential. And I'll pay for it." "Gladly." Harris nodded, unable to speak. But that night, Mark found a poem slipped under his bedroom door, handwritten, raw, about fathers who stay and sons who learn to trust again. Mark kept it in his wallet. Sandy was the hardest. She didn't talk about college. Didn't apply. Just kept drawing and going through motions and pretending she was fine when she clearly wasn't. 2 months after Linda died, Mark found Sandy in the kitchen at 3 a.m., staring at her mother's coffee mug, the one Harris had been keeping, like it held answers. "Can't sleep?" Mark asked. Sandy shook her head. Mark made tea the way Sandy liked it, plain, hot enough to burn, no sugar, and sat across from her. They didn't talk, just sat in the quiet kitchen where Linda had made 1,000 meals and solved 1,000 problems and held her family together through sheer force of will. Finally, Sandy said, "I don't know how to be me without her." The honesty broke something open. "She was the one who understood," Sandy continued. "Who knew when I needed space, and when I needed someone to sit with me, and when I needed—" Her voice cracked. "I'm so angry at her for leaving. And I feel terrible for being angry, because she didn't choose this, but I'm still so angry." Mark reached across the table, palm up, offering. Sandy took his hand. "Your mom told me you carry everyone's pain," Mark said, "that you've been the emotional barometer since you were 5. That you watch and process and take care of everyone else." Sandy nodded. "You don't have to do that anymore," Mark said gently. "You're allowed to be the one who needs taking care of. You're allowed to be angry and lost and not okay. But Kelly needs you to be honest. We all do, even if honest means falling apart." Sandy's tears came then, not quiet, not controlled, but huge gasping sobs that sounded like something breaking after being held together too long. Mark moved around the table, and Sandy collapsed against him, crying in a way that felt like it might never stop. But eventually, it did. And when it was over, Sandy pulled back, wiped her face, and said, "I want to go to art school." "Okay. It's expensive and impractical. And Mom always said—" "Your mom wanted you to be happy," Mark said. "She told me. Right before she died, she said you needed permission to want impractical things, so I'm giving it to you. Go to art school. Be impractical. Make beautiful things." Sandy nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. She really said that? She really did. That morning, as sunrise filtered through the kitchen windows, Sandy showed Mark her portfolio, hundreds of drawings, paintings, sketches, a record of her entire life rendered in graphite and watercolor and charcoal. And Mark understood that this was Linda's legacy. Not the money he could provide or the stability he could offer, but 3 people who knew they were loved enough to chase impossible things. 3 weeks later, Mark made a decision that would have horrified his 20-year-old self. He stepped down as CEO. Not retired, he kept his shares, stayed on the board, remained involved in major decisions. But the daily operations, the relentless pursuit of growth, the empire that had consumed 19 years of his life, he handed it to James. "You're sure?" James asked, even though they both knew Mark had never been more certain of anything. "I have 3 kids who need a father," Mark said simply. "Not a billionaire. A father who shows up for dinner and helps with college applications and sits in hospital waiting rooms when someone gets sick. That's my job now." James smiled. Linda would be proud. Mark hoped so. Because everything he was doing, learning to cook oatmeal and staying up until Harris's midnight breakdowns and sitting with Sandy while she drew, was for her. For the woman who'd loved him when he was nobody and raised 3 incredible humans alone and trusted him at the end to be what they needed. He couldn't replace her. Wouldn't try. But he could continue what she'd started. Love that showed up. Love that stayed. Love that chose legacy over wealth, and family over empire, and presence over perfection. 3 months after Linda died, Mark moved them out of the rental house. Not to a mansion or estate or anywhere that screamed billionaire. To a modest home with 4 bedrooms and a kitchen big enough for all of them to cook together, and a backyard where they planted a garden in Linda's memory. It wasn't the life Mark had imagined. It was better. 1 year later, Mark woke up to the smell of coffee he hadn't made. For a disorienting moment, he hoped it was Linda, standing in the kitchen the way she used to, getting breakfast started before the chaos began. But when he walked into the kitchen, it was Kelly, home for fall break from state school. Still in pajamas, making coffee in the machine, Mark had learned to operate through trial and error and several YouTube tutorials. "Morning," she said without turning around. "Harris is still asleep. Sandy's been up since 5, drawing something in the backyard." "You're up early," Mark observed, pouring himself a cup from the pot Kelly had already started. "Couldn't sleep. Too quiet here after dorm life." Kelly finally looked at him, and Mark saw something in her expression that hadn't been there a year ago. Peace. Not happiness. Grief didn't work that way. Didn't disappear on a schedule. But peace. The kind that came from learning how to exist in a world reshaped by loss. "How's school?" Mark asked. "Hard. Organic chemistry is trying to destroy me. But I'm managing." Kelly smiled slightly. "Got an A on my last anatomy exam. Mom would've." She stopped, the way she always did when Linda's name came up unexpectedly. But this time, instead of breaking down or changing the subject, Kelly continued. "Mom would have made me explain every muscle group, even though she had no idea what I was talking about." Mark smiled. "She would have been proud." "Yeah," Kelly's voice was soft. "She would have been." They drank their coffee in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from a year of learning each other's rhythms, each other's grief patterns, each other's ways of surviving. Harris emerged around 8, hair pointing in 6 directions, wearing a shirt with coffee stains that were definitely older than this morning. "There's my favorite poet," Mark said. Harris made a noise that might have been greeting or protest with Harris. It was hard to tell before caffeine. But he accepted the mug Mark handed him and sat at the kitchen table where he'd spent countless nights this past year, writing and rewriting, and learning that calling yourself a writer meant actually writing, even when it felt impossible. "How's the new piece coming?" Kelly asked. "It's not," Harris said. "Professor says I'm being too careful, too controlled, need to let it be messy." "So let it be messy," Mark said. Harris looked at him over the rim of his mug. "That's terrifying advice coming from a former CEO. Former CEO who learned that control is overrated," Mark corrected. "Some of the best things in my life came from losing control completely." He meant it. A year ago, Mark Jenkins had been a man who optimized everything, who believed success meant eliminating variables and maximizing efficiency. Now he was a man who'd learned that the best things, love, family, connection, were inherently messy, couldn't be controlled or optimized or solved with algorithms, could only be chosen daily, even when they made no logical sense. Sandy came in through the back door, sketchpad tucked under her arm, dirt on her knees from kneeling in the garden they'd planted for Linda. The garden had been Sandy's idea, herbs and vegetables and flowers Linda had loved. A living memorial that required care and attention and showed up differently every season. Right now, in mid-October, it was mostly autumn flowers and the last stubborn tomatoes clinging to vine. "Morning," Sandy said, going straight for the tea kettle. "The chrysanthemums Mom planted are finally blooming. They're perfect." Linda hadn't planted them, of course. Linda had been gone when they'd started the garden. But somewhere in the past year, they'd started attributing things to her mom's flowers, mom's recipe, mom's favorite song as a way of keeping her present without making her absence the only thing that mattered. "We should cut some for the table," Kelly suggested. "Already did." Sandy gestured to the windowsill, where a small mason jar held 3 perfect yellow chrysanthemums. They ate breakfast together, scrambled eggs. Mark had learned to make exactly the way Linda used to. Toast from the bakery on 5th Street that still did day-old discount on Wednesdays. Fruit Kelly had picked up from the farmer's market she discovered near campus. Normal. Ordinary. The kind of morning that would have been impossible to imagine a year ago when they were strangers bound by DNA and tragedy. After breakfast, Kelly disappeared to her room, to video chat with study group. Harris took his coffee and notebook to the backyard, settling under the tree where he did his best thinking. Sandy started a new canvas in the converted garage that Mark had turned into her studio. Proper lighting, ventilation, space to create without worrying about making a mess. And Mark cleaned up the kitchen, loading the dishwasher, wiping counters, doing the small domestic tasks that had become his favorite part of the day. Not because he loved cleaning, but because this ordinary maintenance of a household, this care for the space his family occupied, meant something. Meant he was needed not for his money or his empire or his ability to solve problems, but for his presence, his willingness to show up for the small, unremarkable moments that made a life. That afternoon, they drove to the cemetery. It had become their tradition once a month, sometimes more if someone needed it. They'd visit Linda's grave together. Mark had offered to arrange something elaborate, a monument, something befitting the woman who'd raised 3 incredible humans alone. But the triplets had chosen simple. A modest headstone with Linda's name, her dates, and the words they'd agreed on together. She stayed. We remember. Love continues. Kelly placed fresh flowers, the chrysanthemums from the garden. Harris read a new poem, this one about mothers and memory, and the way grief becomes something you carry, rather than something that carries you. Sandy had brought a small sketch, Linda laughing, rendered in charcoal, the kind of image that captured not what Linda looked like, but who she was. She left it at the base of the headstone, weighted down with a stone so it wouldn't blow away. Mark stood behind them, the way he always did, supporting but not intruding, present but not claiming. You can come closer, you know, Sandy said without turning around. You're allowed to miss her too. It was the first time any of them had acknowledged that Mark's grief was valid, that he'd lost someone too, even if he'd only had her back for a few weeks before she died. Mark stepped forward, standing between Sandy and Harris. I wish I'd had more time with her, he said quietly. Wish I'd been less stupid 19 years ago. Wish I'd known what I was missing. She knew, Kelly said. At the end, she knew you'd take care of us. I'm trying. You're succeeding, Harris said, and it was the closest thing to forgiveness Mark had heard from him yet. They stood together in the October afternoon, 4 people bound by loss and choice, and the daily decision to be family. Not because it was easy, because it mattered. That evening, after Kelly and Harris had retreated to their respective projects, and Sandy was putting final touches on her canvas, Mark sat in the backyard with the notebook Linda had given him, the one filled with unsent letters. He'd read them all now, multiple times. Had learned about Kelly's first steps, and Harris's first poem, and Sandy's first drawing. Had traced 18 years of milestones through Linda's handwriting, her observations, her love rendered in words she'd never intended anyone to read. And he'd started writing his own. Not to Linda, though. Sometimes it felt like he was talking to her. But to Kelly, Harris, and Sandy. A record of this year. Of everything he was learning. Of the moments he wanted them to remember when he was gone, and they needed proof that he'd stayed. Dear Kelly, you got your first A in organic chemistry today. You called to tell me, voice bright with pride and relief and exhaustion. And I realized, I know what that sounds like now, your proud voice. The way it lifts at the end, questioning, like you're waiting for permission to celebrate. You don't need permission. You've earned every success through work your mother taught you how to do. But I'm proud of you anyway. Not because of the grade, because you're becoming exactly who you're meant to be. He wrote to Harris about the poetry reading, where Harris had performed for the first time, voice shaking but steady, sharing words he'd hidden for so long. Wrote to Sandy about the gallery show she'd been accepted into her first professional exhibition, Linda's portrait, the centerpiece. Wrote about the ordinary moments that made up a life, Tuesday movie nights, Sunday morning pancakes, the way they'd learned to talk about Linda without falling apart every time. Mark didn't know if they'd ever read these letters. Didn't matter. What mattered was the record, the proof that he'd been present, that he'd chosen them, daily, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. As the sun set, Mark heard the back door open. All three triplets emerged, drawn by some unspoken agreement. They settled around him, Kelly on the porch steps, Harris sprawled on the grass, Sandy cross-legged beside Mark's chair. "Remember when you showed up with 4 pizzas and had no idea what you were doing?" Kelly said, smiling at the memory. "I still don't know what I'm doing," Mark admitted. "Yeah, but now you're bad at it, with us instead of alone," Harris said. Sandy leaned her head against Mark's knee. "Mom would be happy that we gave you a chance, that you stayed." "I'll always stay," Mark said, and he meant it. Not as a promise to Linda, though she'd asked it of him, but as a promise to himself, to the man he'd become in the year since a dying woman had opened her door and given him one last chance to be a father. Love wasn't something that happened once. It wasn't a moment or a feeling or a grand gesture that fixed everything. Love was a choice, made daily, made in pizza deliveries and hospital waiting rooms and cemetery visits and ordinary Tuesday evenings when nothing happened except being together. Love was staying when leaving would be easier. Love was showing up imperfectly and trying anyway. Love was learning that the empire he'd built meant nothing compared to 3 people who called him dad now, tentatively, like they were still testing whether he'd earned it. He had. Not through money or grand gestures or trying to replace what they'd lost, but through presence, through staying, through choosing them over and over, until choosing them became as natural as breathing. If you made it this far, if you stayed through every tear and every moment of healing, then you understand something most people never learn, that love, once chosen, is never too late. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that second chances are real, that showing up matters, that families aren't just born, they're built through daily choices and stubborn, imperfect love. Comment "Love continues" if this story changed something in you. Subscribe, because stories like this, stories about real love, real loss, real redemption, these are the ones worth telling. And Linda's legacy? It lives on every time someone chooses to stay. The stars came out above their modest backyard, the garden Linda had inspired, the home they'd made together from grief and second chances and stubborn, imperfect love. And Mark Jenkins, former Billionaire CEO, absent father, man who'd spent 19 years building the wrong things, finally understood what legacy meant. Not the empire. Not the money. Not the success that would be forgotten in a generation. But this. 3 people who knew they were loved. 3 people who'd learned that love, once chosen, never came too late. 3 people who'd taught him that being present was the only success that mattered. "Love you guys," Mark said quietly. Kelly leaned back against the steps. "Love you too, Dad." Harris smiled into the darkness. Sandy squeezed his hand. And somewhere in the chrysanthemums blooming against the odds, in the October wind carrying the scent of autumn, in the way ordinary moments became sacred when you paid attention, Linda Davison's wish came true. They were a family. Messy, imperfect, honest. And love, once chosen, was never too late.